Hello everyone, this is update for June 8 and June 7, 2023, day 470 of the war, end of the date update. So first I'm going to do a little bit more macroeconomy today. As always, going to look at the situation in the US banking system. So as you can see, the stress remains sort of in remission largely. I mean, there's little uptick, if you can see, from the last week to 288 billion US dollars, but generally speaking, situation in remission. It doesn't, but the problem didn't go away. It's there, just a question of time. Also, another indication of the situation is interest rate that is charged on this BTFP program. BTFP is part of it, as you can see here. It's the orange one. It's actually rising, as you can see. That's why there was a little bit of a slightly rise in the whole sort of synthetic amount of loans that are borrowed from the Federal Reserve. So the interest rate is actually hit all-time high. I think it was like 5.25 or something along those. So you can see there's clear indication of renewal of the problem in the system. It will probably at very, very early stages, so it's going to take time. But we may be in a situation where remission is going to be over and the crisis will come back. Which shape and form we will find out once it hits, but as I said, the problem is not resolved. Now let's look at a little bit of macroeconomic data. So first of all, as always, let's look at China. As you've seen, numbers are terrible. So first of all, export is down year on year, 7.5%. That's really, again, going back to Chinese economy. The driver there is this export economy, and as you can see, it's crashing pretty astoundingly at really huge pace. Import is also obviously down, but the biggest problem is for China is now it looks like two parts of the economy, which is real estate bubble and just generally consumption, internal consumption bubble in China is basically broken. And the second part of the economy, the actual driver, the actually wealth generator for Chinese economy that actually sustains the bubble part, which is this export of the manufactured goods, it's also going down, broken essentially, right? So going back to the Chinese situation, this really creates very stressful internal environment in China, social situation in China, and that may force hand of the Chinese leadership to invade Taiwan. Not so much even, everything else as the threat of the social unrest, which is very big concern in China in general. Then another sort of supporting evidence is first of all CPI. This is consumer inflation. So basically, the internal, the consumption bubble that I mentioned. So as you can see, the inflation is slowing down. It's only 0.2 year on year. Months on months, it's actually starting to decline. So again, this means that consumer there is extremely weak, and confirming the idea that the bubble, that consumption bubble, which is real estate, is part of it, is broken and basically deflating. Then, if we look at PPI, Purchasing Price Index, this is for manufacturers. So this is minus 4.6. We can this could be proxy for the manufacturers for the export market. So as you can see, this again confirms the weakness in export, and therefore those manufacturers that produce good for export, they cannot pay higher prices to their suppliers for raw materials. So this this translates in this prices going down. So essentially, this is kind of like a dominoes, right? It starts from that. There is no export, but there's not enough demand for export. That in turns leads to lower prices for raw materials, for the manufactured goods. So as you can see, the situation in China pretty ugly. I would say it actually stands out more than any other economy on relative sort of scale, because there were numbers from Germany. It's not great, but it's sort of okay. Actually, Japan is doing relatively okay. So again, this is really a China story, not so much, which obviously will affect the world because China is second largest economy. But so far, it's more internal story in China, and apparently, problems with exporting its goods to the world, and obviously, U.S. is probably a big part of that. Then let's actually look at Canada, and the reason I bring Canada here because productivity there is declining as well. As you can see, 0.6%, which is not as bad as in US. I think about months ago, I was talking about the decline in productivity in US, which is one of the worst signs in general for the future of the economy, of the well-being of basically everybody's well-being, because that's going to really affect you cannot hide from that. And in US, it was, I think, negative 2.6 or 7, something along those lines. Then it was actually revised a little bit better to minus 2.1, but still pretty ugly number. So as you can see, Canada is having the same problem. What this really translates into is two things: is standard of living declining both in the US and in Canada. And there will be the inflation will persist, even though the commodity part of the inflation is probably going to go away, just because, as you can see, commodity prices are starting to sort of recede due to problems in China, mostly because it was huge consumer of commodities from around the world, and because it's, as I discussed, because of the problems there, they don't consume as much. So, however, as you can see, even though, despite this, reprieve from commodities, Canadian central bank increased on the same date interest rate from 4.5 to 4.75, right? So again, as you can see, the same idea. If the central banks sort of it's not sort of formally declared, but they are largely driven by what's going on with productivity. And the only way to restore productivity is actually to increase interest rates, which is what they're doing. And in a way, this confirms that all of this rate increases, they are forced. They not because central banks are willing to do that. It's politically unpopular. Absolutely unpopular in any country, from business perspective, from all, nobody's happy basically socially when interest rates go up, but they have no choice because, as you can see, in US productivity is really dropping. In Canada, not as terribly, but still pretty bad. So they are forced to do that to actually restore the growth of productivity, or at least to stop the decline of it. And that's really one of the biggest drivers of all of that. Now, actually, let's switch to Ukraine. First, I want to kind of discuss a little bit strategic situation, and then we will do quick walks through the front line. So, going back to that Kakhovka Dam, there is another confirming. I mentioned that most likely, in my opinion, who blew it up was Russian side, and may not be, from the political top. It was probably on the local military command as sort of like desperation move to stop Ukrainian offensive. which they probably did put how to say, final nail in the coffin to have a pause in Ukrainian offensive. So I believe they did achieve their goal. But let me explain another reason why it's terrible for Ukrainian. There is literally zero incentive to do that. So as I mentioned before, Kryvyi Rih, it's a large industrial central Ukraine. I can even say part of the industrial heart of Ukraine. Extremely important, basically. The city is, and I mentioned before, it was using water from Dnipro, from this Kakhovka artificial lake, and without it, they cannot. They don't have water, so they have left water for 1.5 months, and that's assuming they use it very sparingly. So basically, they need to reduce the consumption of the water. So again, it really hurts Ukraine from all angles. It destroys business or production there, because there are steel mills there. There's iron ore production there. And it also creates social stress, because it's not only industry, it's also socially, it's actually extremely unclear what's going to happen in 1.5 months there. So again, very unlikely that it was done by Ukraine. Most likely that's done by the Russian side. And sort of on the other side, you probably heard about the ammonia pipeline that goes from Tolyatti, which is I don't have it here, but basically a city on Volga, but it goes from there to Odessa, right? So it carries ammonia, which is precursor for making nitrogen-based fertilizer for agriculture, which is urea is one of them. And so in this case, it was blown up actually here, not far away from Kupiansk. It actually was literally on the front line, and in this case, either side could have done it, but because they are shelling, it's the military sort of interest prevails everything else, and nobody cares where they're gonna hit. They just really want to hit the enemy, and how that's gonna get achieved. Nobody cares. Basically, there are no rules in reality on the front line, and that's the only rule. There is no rules, and so it's totally possible that Ukrainian side hit it as well. Could be Russian side. So here, definitely, either side could be at fault. If I were to say who has sort of more interest, I would say Ukrainian side, right? Because Ukraine wants to prevent Russia from exporting this ammonia through Odessa, right? And because of this accident, now this pipeline is out for months to 3 months. So it's out of question that Russia, at least for the next 3 months, is probably Russia won't be able to export ammonia, right? So that's that's just my opinion, as I said. Now let's switch actually to this offensive that sort of, as I wrote before, it kind of fizzled out. So I would say on the 8th was kind of like first day, we was sort of relatively quiet. There are still some pushes, but it's essentially that's it. That's over. And as I said, the explosion of this dam kind of created a problem for Ukrainian side, because there was the idea of expanding from bridgeheads on the eastern side of Dnipro River, or on the whole artificial lake, and start moving toward Crimea and essentially collapsing Russian front line, because you have essentially hit from the rear. And as I said before, this front line along the Dnipro River is extremely thinly defended. Extremely, like I would say, it's probably 2 brigades for their entire length of it, which probably, I don't know, I want to say 250 kilometers probably, plus minus. So effectively, you cannot really defend effectively for the Russian side, and basically Ukraine, given that Ukraine has more troops on the western side, they basically could literally, without really trying much, establish enough bridgeheads to the point that Russian side could not sort of defend them, or could not attack them effectively, and one of them would work out, and then you build the large one from that one, and then you start move towards, first of all, into the rear of the Russian forces here, and then also to Crimea, obviously, which obviously will create a collapse, and especially if you put pressure from here in Zaporizhia region, right, on Zaporizhia front line, so that Russian troops are engaged and they cannot sort of, there is not enough reserves to kind of like counterattack here, so you essentially done. But this whole plan kind of failed, and that's why this dam was blown up, and now Ukrainian command is, I guess, on pause to really rethink how to move forward. And unfortunately, there's not really much you can do. It's otherwise it just really frontal attacks, which are going to be extremely costly and most likely actually will fail. If you see, we've probably seen videos from the Russian side where Ukrainian troops are attacking is in sort of criminally insane way, Russian side, and leads to high losses and close to zero successes effectively. Ukraine does not have that advantage to waste its resources to that level, and so and it's obviously clear to Ukrainian command, and that's what I was referring before, that the problem is not so much equipment. Ukraine will can get this Western equipment, but if Ukrainian military is not sort of reformed, where there is initiative, where soldiers or people are not disempowered, it's not going to be able to overcome Russian side, because there is the quantity of weapons on the Russian side, and Ukraine does not have advantage to fight war of attrition. So again, going back to all of this is that Leopards, they're not going to change anything by themselves. The same way, whenever Ukraine gets F-16s, they really not going to change things significantly. As I said, mentioned before, Ukraine didn't need to get like 200 of F-16, which I think is not going to happen ever. Let's put it this way. The more realistic solution for Ukraine is get 5, 6, 700 of 155 millimeter howitzers to create enough density of artillery and learn how to use counter battery fire, and for that you need equivalent of Orlan 10, which Ukraine still does not have. And I mentioned this many videos made about this, how important this tool. It's sort of not sexy, it's very primitive, it's you're not going to get famous for it, but it actually does tremendous job for the Russian side. And Ukraine still doesn't have it, and there is not even to my knowledge active sort of work on develop something in equivalent, even like literally copycat primitively this Orlan 10 and whatever call it something similar, but have that tool, because without that tool artillery is essentially blind, and you cannot do a counter artillery fight, and then the whole offensive, the whole idea of offensive is just the hope for luck that somehow, or that you're gonna use sort of mid grinder type of strategy But as I said, Ukraine cannot afford that. And so this is the whole kind of situation at this point. Then this sort of um, uh, so-called offensive that's sort of announced by Ukrainian sort of officials here in around Bakhmut. It's really not really true offensive. It's just kind of like tactical push to really hide the real location, or the basically the whole situation of what's really happening. That the attempt to have a major offensive so far failed, and there's really no clear strategic answer what to do next. And I think that really creates big pressure, big problem for Ukrainian military and for Ukrainian political top to show results to the West. So that's a sort of situation there. Then in terms of now, let's actually do a quick walkthrough. We're gonna do clockwise fashion as I always do, and we're gonna start along the state border. And I'm just gonna immediately actually jump to the situation here in Belgorod region. So the situation remains the same. RDK continues sort of operating on the Russian side, creating a lot of headache for basically Russian political top, essentially. It doesn't look so that it managed to attract regular Russian units to this area from the front line. So far, from what I'm seeing, is the most using conscripts and special forces. If you remember, the Russian side was extremely actively using special forces brigades. Like here, I have like 14 special forces brigades. I think there's also 22nd here in Zaporizhia front line. They were actively using them during initial phase of offensive war against Ukraine. But as it turns into more sort of World War One, they stopped using those special forces brigades. So basically, you have here a mix of those special forces brigades, mostly conscripts, and special forces brigades, more like a sort of backbone for the whole system. And conscripts are the meat, and the border guards is another sort of part of the meat, and to some extent also part of the bone. So that's essentially what's going on. And so far, the sort of strategic answer from the Russian side is, okay, we're gonna let this 5-10 kilometer zone along the state border on the Russian side to turn into no man's zone, kind of like where RDK can roam. And that's sort of our answer. We don't have enough resources to kind of push them out, so we're gonna keep them sort of at bay without bringing in regular Russian troops. Because obviously, as you can imagine, because there is expectation of offensive, so everything needs to be on the front line in terms of regular Russian units. So this is sort of looks like decision on the Russian side. Was a sort of very reasonable attempt, but didn't work out the way sort of it expected. It doesn't mean this is sort of over, but it's just in sort of this iteration, it didn't work out. Now let's jump to North Lugansk front line. Sort of this is kind of like strategic dead end for both sides here. Nothing really major happening on either side here. Now let's move to North Donbas front line. Things here there is some activity here, but as I said, it's more of a tactical situation where Ukrainian side is trying to push Russian forces sort of north and south of Bakhmut, and Russian side trying to do counterattacks. That's essentially, but it's all like low scale tactical sort of, I wouldn't say skirmishes, but it's not sort of major decisive fights that can lead to any serious outcome on either side. So as you can see, basically Russian side was counterattacking towards Ivanivsk, Ukrainian side continuing its attempts to to liberate Berhivka, which actually would be a pretty big sort of result, because then it really creates a problem for this kind of forces withdrawal from this sort of kind of salient here. But so far they have not managed to really create sort of credible threat there. Now let's move to central Donbass front line. Things here very similar. Russian troops started some attacks, not just in Marinka, but now in Piski salient, now north of Avdiivka. So it kind of a little bit returns to sort of business as usual here, not fully, but apparently Russian command is becoming a little bit more sort of relaxed and comfortable with the situation. Now let's look at Zaporizhia front line. So the only place where there was attack, and it was really actually on the 7th, was from this Malatakmachka towards south, was largely repelled with looks like fairly painful losses for Ukrainian side. It's somewhat unclear if those, if there are a couple Leopard tanks, Leopard 2 tanks to be more specific, were disabled there. But it's very possible. So this goes back, and the whole attack was just is as wrong as it gets how it should be done. Let's put it this way, because it looks like the fields were not demined properly. There was no proper artillery support, so there was just this group was just sent like a sort of trial balloon, like a kamikaze group, see what happens, and they were demanding with their equipment sort of this battlefield, and effectively then they were destroyed by Russian artillery. So didn't even create sort of credible threat, didn't even sort of started into real fight with even Russian infantry essentially. So again, as I said, this is very clear that there is organizational problem in Ukrainian army, and as I said, I call it sort of Soviet army, and Russian army is no different, right? They do the same things. That's why I say that they both the same. The problem, though, for Ukraine is that Ukraine, 4 times smaller than Russia at least, and probably right now 5 times smaller than Russia. So you simply cannot, play the same game. The only sort of strategic answer for Ukraine is to be more efficient. Without efficiency, this war of attrition eventually leads to Ukrainian loss, and that's a problem. And I don't think that problem is fully realized, or maybe realized, but sort of no interest to change by Ukrainian political and military top at this point. As you can see, the most of the reserves were built up for the offensive. They were not committed to the sort of attacks, or there was more like initial strong pushes to see what happens, and I would say the result was quite disappointing, where it's very clear that there is no need to push further, because all you can do, you're just going to expand your resources without achieving much. Or even if you may achieve something at the point where you out of resources and you don't have resources to exploit opportunities that you finally created. So this is where it all stands at this point. I'm sure Ukrainian command is rethinking what to do next. And to be fair, with the current setup, there is really not much of sort of real solutions. And the only real solution is, reorganizing the army. Otherwise, at this point, it just going to be on pause for really quite a while until Ukraine gets many more Western equipment. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. And until next time. Bye bye.